Hello, Colin.
Hello, hello.
Uh, Thank you for joining me this afternoon.
It's good to be back.
So, how do you feel about discussing psychopathology and personality today?
I think that seems like a good idea. Seems like a good follow on from our last conversation.
Great. Uh, where would you like to begin?
Well, I mean, I guess one place we could begin is just with the definition that we came up with for psychopathology, because so the idea was basically to tie. Well, so we have this. So I developed this theory that we talked about last time, cybernetic Big Five theory. That's a theory of personality and how personality works. And it turns out that the major ways in which different symptoms of psychopathology appear in people correspond to the major dimensions of personality. And so what that means is that the typical patterns of people's personalities are also the ways in which people break down when things start to go wrong, when they have dysfunction. Right. So if you are, and of course, psychopathology is often triggered by external stressors, but I guess the lesson is that regardless of what causes you to break down in some way, where you break down, where the faults are, or the weaknesses are, tend to correspond to the extremities in your personality. And that's not universally 100% true. You can sometimes find a person who is generally a very happy person, very stable person, and something terrible happens in their lives and they suffer an episode of severe depression, right? Clinically diagnosable depression. And you can see that basically just as a kind of normal functioning of the human organism, but moving into a regime that's extreme enough that it gets stuck, basically. But so that's rare compared to what usually happens, which is that somebody who tends to be a bit depressive in their personality in general, even if they're generally fine and can get along, well in life, something bad happens to them, and they are more easily thrown into a deep depressive state, or an attractor that's hard to get out of, than somebody who started off with low tendency toward depression. And it's
Would would you say that so the extremes are not necessarily problematic or pathological, but it might be if you get stuck in one of the extremes, it might
yeah,
be that's
yeah. I mean, so that's kind of jumping ahead to one of what I think of as like the punchlines of our theory of psychopathology, which is that merely having extreme levels on one of these trait dimensions, even if it's a dimension that is explicitly described as a dimension of psychopathology, because we can talk about these systems like high top that are basically cataloging different symptoms and different ways that symptoms tend to go together. And so they're explicitly supposed to be about features of psychopathology, but it turns out that even having extreme levels on those dimensions is not inherently psychopathological. Just to use my favorite example quickly to make this more concrete, there's this cool study of psychics who have daily auditory hallucinations and believe that they're communicating with other realms, spirits of the dead, different astral planes, whatever. And so, if you just look at that symptom dimension of delusions and hallucinations, which we usually think of as a feature of psychosis, one of the most extreme kinds of mental illnesses that people suffer from, we would think, oh, that person has, that person has a mental illness. But in fact, these are people who are using this peculiarity of their cognitive functioning as part of their job. Some of them are earning a living as psychics. They may have totally stable relationships, stable careers.
they
So
might
they
even
don't,
be helping people. Like it might even
right?
be like a conduit for their intuition
Of
about people.
course, of course, right? So they're not, they don't qualify for a diagnosis of schizophrenia because, one of the criteria in the current diagnostic system is that you have to have some kind of distress or impairment, and they don't have those things. But nonetheless, they have these features of psychopathology, and like the study that I was thinking of compared that group of psychics to a group of people with diagnosis of psychosis. And in terms of the severity on their hallucination scores, they don't differ. Of course, the patients, the psychotic patients, have a lot of elevated problems on other symptom dimensions that the psychics don't have. But if we just compare that one specific dimension, which we usually think of as the, like cardinal feature of psychosis, of severe mental illness, no empirical difference. So that would be a good place to segue back to our definition of psychopathology, which is that psychopathology is a persistent failure to be able to move toward your important goals in life, with goals defined broadly to include things like, basic human needs that almost everyone has to some extent, like need for affiliation, need for a sense of, competence and autonomy, those kinds of things. And so you have to have an inability to pursue your important goals, your basic needs, coupled with an inability to adapt and develop new goals or new interpretations of the world or new strategies for pursuing your goals that might allow you to get back on track.
And these strategies you call characteristic adaptations.
So all three of those things would be characteristic adaptations. So goals are a form of characteristic adaptation when they are explicitly about concrete things in your life, like concrete aspects of your situation. Variations in the strength of having a goal, like one of these basic needs, like a need for affiliation, because essentially everyone has that to some degree. And so that doesn't count as a characteristic adaptation. That's more of a trait. Like how much you need affiliation is a trait difference. And that's just to, I guess, remind people of our previous conversation. The fundamental difference that my theory makes between traits and characteristic adaptations is that traits are dimensions of psychological variation that could be used to describe people and differentiate people in any human environment, any human culture at any time in history. And so from the dawn of humanity, there have been differences in how much affiliation people want and need. So that is a trait. But something like, how much, I don't know, whether you want to, get married or not, or anything about affiliation that refers to specific cultural features that wouldn't be present for every culture, then that is in the realm of characteristic adaptation. And so the ways that
talking about like the cybernetic control parameters that define us as the kinds of systems that we are, as opposed to a specific set of learned tendencies or policies or specific plans, that would then be in general in the service of those traits.
Right. On the other hand, maybe you want to say that the mechanisms that the traits are associated with are in service of the characteristic adaptations, right? Because you have this cybernetic machinery that allows you to pursue your goals effectively. And so the parameters of the different elements of that machinery, everybody has the machinery, and it's just tuned in slightly different ways. And those tunings are trait differences. But what the machinery is for is to allow you to carry out specific goals and actually do things in the world. And those specific goals, those concretely specified goals, and those specific strategies that you use to pursue them, and the various kinds of interpretations that you make and that you've learned about the world that you navigate, those are the characteristic adaptations. And all of that machinery is there precisely to allow you to create and run those characteristic adaptations. So in some ways,
the characteristic adaptations are like the business end of what gets things done in the world.
It's where the rubber meets the road. Yes, exactly. Right. And that's why our theory of psychopathology specifies that all psychopathology ultimately needs to be identified, defined, diagnosed in terms of a failure of characteristic adaptations, not merely having extreme personality traits or extreme, even if you want to call them psychopathological traits, because that's the interesting thing. These are referred to as dimensions of psychopathology. But even though they're called that, it's a little misleading because they're not necessarily psychopathological unless they prevent you from being able to enact your characteristic adaptations and pursue your important goals.
So this is both a principled focus on the characteristic adaptations, but also practically this might like avoid essentialization that's like question begging, or it might some kinds of stigma, or and it might, and it's more like you have something to work with for change.
Yeah.
Like
Yes. So one of the things that we talk about in theory, and I should say when I say we here, I'm talking about me and Bob Kruger, who is my collaborator and co-author of this theory, the psychopathology part. So the way that we think about this is that there are essentially two types of intervention for psychopathology, and those correspond to the difference between traits and characteristic adaptations. And so a trait intervention is one that's attempting to retune these basic underlying mechanisms. And so the major form of that is pharmacology, right? It's drug therapies. So if you give somebody an SSRI or a Ritalin or
let's reduce eroticism,
or
let's increase that extroversion.
lithium, for example, right? You're retuning some of these underlying trait parameters. Basically, you're saying, okay, well, we're going to damp down on your error sensitivity, so you're not experiencing everything as a problem. And that's the ideal, right? That's what we want to do. But of course, in fact, these tools that we have to do that are very messy, because we don't understand the underlying neurobiological systems well enough to design drug interventions that are very specifically targeted. So there tends to be, we call them side effects, but of course they're just effects. Some effects are the ones we want, some effects are the ones we don't want. And so, so in general, I think that we massively overprescribe drugs for mental health problems, which is not to say that like drugs are always the wrong approach, because sometimes the problem really is that there are just some of these underlying parameters that are tuned so extremely for that person that they just really tend to make the system careen out of control in one way or another, right? Like if you have severe proneness to mania, I don't know that there's any better solution at this point than a drug
lithium
regime, probably involving lithium. Right. And the funny thing about that is we still don't understand exactly why lithium works in the way that it works from a neurobiological perspective, but it does seem to work fairly well in terms of like keeping the dopaminergic system from spinning off out of control into hyperactivity, in which you are just like everything is possible.
Maybe some kind of buffering of activity levels in some way.
Yeah,
but we don't know. Yeah.
Right. So in other words, definitely
not
not
enough
saying that
will help you get up. Too much will bring you down.
Right. So definitely not saying that we should eliminate drug therapies, but just that I think in a lot of cases, the problem is that people need to learn different, like the brain is working in a reasonably normal way. It's just that it has learned the wrong habits is one way of thinking about it.
I don't know if this inference follows, but would you say that like the fact that like a large amount, maybe even the lion's share of efficacy of something like an SSRI seems to be a placebo effect, does that imply that like there's actually, even in those cases, there might be a mediation substantially occurring by something like characteristic adaptations, if you could recapitulate the efficacy via like expectancy?
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it, actually. Right. So if there's a placebo effect, it's because you believe that this is going to help you. That belief is a characteristic adaptation, right? It involves your knowledge of everything that goes into like, the medical system and the drug and what you know about it. And so your belief that something is being done to help you is then actually, calming you down, essentially. Or, a more sophisticated way to say that would be that it is reducing the gain on your threat sensor fundamentally, because you're saying, well, what your brain is implicitly saying is, I am now in a safer place because the place includes this drug. Therefore, I don't have to be quite so quick to identify everything as dangerous and terrible. So that's how the placebo component would work. But of course, like serotonin is a massively powerful neurotransmitter, and it is doing all kinds of stuff in your brain. But it's far less specific than just, making you depressed or not.
Yeah.
And so it's like, why have we always thought about this? It's like driving a nail with a sledgehammer, right? You give somebody an SSRI. It's like, okay, we want to just tune this little thing right here. Bam!
For a finely tuned system that's going to have all sorts of knock-on effects for anything you do. Right. And we're actually, there's sometimes like the thing to do is like slap the device and then it works better. But
yeah. Right, and knock you out of an attractor state. Well, and that's the whole theory behind psychedelic treatments, right? Is that they are basically scrambling your brain up enough that it can settle back down into a different attractor state than the problematic one that it's been in.
Shaking the snow globe, as they say.
Shaking the snow globe, yes.
Yeah.
Although, okay, terrible analogy, right? Because the snow globe is totally stochastic. You shake it up, the snow is going to fall in a very even pattern.
I guess that's the relaxed beliefs model, is that you actually are like taking the grooves that would happen as like you. And I guess there's like I don't know if there's like an implicit model that of a continuity between traits and states. I don't think the personality is being thought of in terms explicitly of characteristic adaptations and traits, but like, as you take a different, you have like a ski slope, and then as people go down certain paths, there's more grooves and more people follow those paths. And then if you, the grooves just go deeper and deeper. So if you shake it, the idea is like you flatten the belief landscape, and then there's more possibility instead of going into the usual grooves.
Okay, so it's a snow globe with mountains in it and skiers.
Yes.
Yeah, then it works. Yeah.
Although I've been suggesting that that would be a model of maybe like high dose psychedelics, the kind used like psychedelic psychotherapy, but there could be like other models where it's actually, rather than like relaxing your beliefs in a kind of like general normalization or equalizing of things, it could actually, like something like microdosing or mesodosing could be therapeutic in terms of actually giving you the energy, the activation energy you might need to carve out a new path, to maybe create new characteristic adaptations. And so
it's more increasing confidence, increasing precision, right, and potentially making you slightly more flexible, but mostly in the context of like active coping. Right. I mean, I don't know how deep we want to get into the serotonergic system here, but like we're talking about the difference between hitting, mostly 5-HT1A receptors versus mostly 5-HT2A receptors. And
I think later we should go deeper, but real quickly for the listeners, like there's this model by Carhart Harrison Nutt of passive versus active coping, where the serotonin 5-HT1A system will be, it's a lower threshold system, more easily activated, and the response to some kind of threat or challenge would be something more like patience or staying the course, being still, thinking a bit more. Kind of the thing you might want like a prey animal to do, or something like there's a threat, be still, like don't get fancy. But then like if the threat goes beyond a certain level, then the serotonin, maybe it's the serotonin receptors or getting activated by serotonin itself or something else, but threat past a certain level will then switch to an active coping strategy, something like run for the hills or fight for your life or do something creative. And so you would have like these two receptor classes that have a kind of like opponency of the 1A and the 2A, or a difference in that the 1A would come on easy, that might be something like an SSRI would act more on that, but the 2A would be harder to activate, but when you activate it, boy hell, that's going to be a more powerful effect, and potentially of a kind that could allow for the creation of new characteristic adaptations and reshaping of personality.
Yeah. And I would even say that the sort of passive coping, active coping distinction is too specific in terms of the way that I think about what serotonin does. that I think that the 5-HT1A receptors are just generally stabilizing, and which, you can see that in terms of passive coping, right? Where passive coping basically is just that you try to defend yourself and keep going along the course that you're on. But that seems to be what serotonin does at the level of neural ensembles, like just all over. That it's basically making, when you add serotonin to any particular neural system or subsystem, you are basically making it require more inputs in order to change its outputs. You're stabilizing its function. And this is, of course, one of the basic requirements of any cybernetic system, is that it has to be able to maintain the stability of its function in order to pursue goals effectively. So
and that's looping back to our previous conversation, where for the hierarchical structure of the Big Five trait hierarchy, the two meta traits are identified, or Colin identified as stability as the shared variance of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and inverse neuroticism, and plasticity as a shared variance of openness and extroversion. And so you're saying that serotonin, specifically the 1A system, would help to have this stabilizing function. And it seems to be a multi-scale story happening at the level of the person, but even at the level of the neuronal ensemble, you'll see this. And I'm thinking of this one paper that's probably it might be one of my favorite papers of all time that you sent me, which is showing this even at the level of within the cell of like the microtubule dynamics of something
right,
like,
even structurally, right? Serotonin even structurally is stabilizing, physical structure of the organism, which is, it's amazing.
I'll link that in the notes of the video, that paper. It's awesome.
All right. Yeah. And so, right, so you have, and 5-HT1A activation is kind of like the default chronic functioning of the serotonergic system, because it's a sort of relatively low normal amounts of serotonin being released. And so, your default mode, of course, should be to stay the course as a cybernetic system. And then the 5-HT2A receptors, that whole 5-HT2 class of receptors, seem to be more about plasticity. And I just had a thought now when we were talking about the difference between low dose and high dose, that maybe what you're seeing there basically is that at low doses you still get extroverted plasticity. You get exploration that is more behaviorally capable, focused in like confidence in being able to apply your existing schemas, your existing strategies, policies to novel situations. Whereas when you go to high dose, you're really getting just exclusively openness oriented plasticity, where it's just like all the ideas are up in the air, all your interpretations of the world are up in the air, and you're just seeing, you're seeing new stuff. Stuff is not making sense, or else it's making sense in totally new and different ways. So you get like a transition from a more sort of assimilative exploration to accommodative exploration in Piagetian terms.
Where assimilation being you take what exists and you put it into your existing schemas and interpret it in those terms. Where accommodating is you actually update and adjust your schemas in the face of the new information.
Right, exactly, right. And so, they're both, from Piaget talked about them both as forms of learning. So they're both about how you deal with novelty, with the unknown. But assimilation is you take the new stuff and you say, I can interpret this in terms of the old stuff. Or like I can, the things that I already know how to do in these old environments that are familiar is also going to work with these new environments or with this new stimulus or whatever it is. Whereas accommodation is like, okay, I've got to readjust my interpretations, readjust my schema to fit this new information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so one interesting thing to bring it back around to topic here is that, so you mentioned stability as this higher order personality factor. And, in some ways, sometimes I regret choosing those very abstract labels, stability and plasticity, for those broad personality factors, because those two terms have so many different meanings at so many different levels, and so applying them specifically to personality, sometimes people think you're talking about other levels. So because personality traits have a certain stability because they tend to be relatively consistent over time for people. That's what makes them personality traits. Like, you're not like a massive extrovert for 2 weeks and then a massive introvert for 2 weeks. Now that's relatively persistent. Even if you might have a week even as an extrovert where you're acting introverted, but your general tendency remains the same. So there's that kind of stability, but then stability, the personality trait, this combination of high conscientiousness, high agreeableness, low neuroticism, is more about the stability of your goal-directed functioning and how well your characteristic adaptations persist in order to allow you to move toward your goals effectively and not get distracted or disrupted by emotional meltdowns of one kind or another. So it's
the stability of your governance by your goal hierarchy as a cybernetic system, as opposed to the stability of your personality over time.
Right. So
although there could be some relationship between these things.
There could, and in fact there are, because there's actually research showing that people's personality traits, all of them, are more likely to change when they are lower in stability, this personality trait that's this higher order factor. So indeed there is sort of feedback between those levels.
And for psychopathology, so maybe just a little bit of background on high top for listeners. So you mentioned high top and maybe briefly mentioning like the psychopathology factor P.
Yeah, so high top stands for Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology. It's a consortium that I'm part of, and what its goals are to develop an empirical, quantitatively based system for classifying features of psychopathology, so signs and symptoms of psychopathology, based on which ones tend to go together with each other within individual people. So for example, people who experience anxiety are also much more likely to experience depression. Those two things very often co-occur. And so that's reflected in high top as a higher order dimension that's labeled distress, which is basically risk for things related to anxiety and things related to depression. So it's hierarchical in the sense that you can go down low in the hierarchy and get these very specific types of symptoms, like we talked about hallucinations, and you can even break those down into like auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. But then you can go up in the hierarchy, and then you've got hallucinations and delusions joined together in a more general tendency toward psychosis. Same with anxiety, right? You've got anxiety and depression. You can think of those individually, or you can think of the shared tendency as distress. So it's a really useful way to understand the patterns of symptoms that we actually see empirically in the world, in the clinic.
And how is the hierarchy derived?
Well, it's derived from a couple of different data sources. Some of them have to do with just relying on existing diagnoses. That's problematic because the system is ultimately designed to replace existing diagnoses. Because the problem with there are two major problems with the existing diagnostic systems, like DSM, that are that are official in the world of medicine. One is that they treat these things categorically, whereas we have just mountains of evidence from the last century of science to show that they are almost never categorical. They're always continuous. In other words, there isn't one category of people in the world who are psychotic and everybody else is not. Or like one category of people in the world has ADHD and everybody else does not. Instead, what there are spectra, right? They're continua. And so what you have is people have the kinds of characteristics that get described as ADHD, and that's distributed in the population. And when you get above a certain threshold, it starts to become without considering any threshold, as you get more and more of those characteristics and more and more intensity, they become more and more likely to disrupt your life and to cause trouble for you. And so what medicine does is that it sets a threshold somewhat arbitrarily where we say, well, okay, if you're that severe on those symptoms, then we're going to say, yes, now you have this categorical entity called ADHD, or called schizophrenia, or called major depression, whatever you want to pick. But we know that that's not actually how nature works. There is no dividing line. There is no group of people who are special because they have this thing and everybody else does not have it. Instead, there's a continuum, and we decide where we're going to start diagnosing and where we're going to start paying attention and intervening with people on that continuum. So,
and these configurations could have even not been pathological in other contexts. They might even be like adaptive life history strategies and evolution. But in the modern context, like you were mentioning just now, the psychic medium, that person might have been like a very talented like mystic or priestess or
shaman.
Yeah.
But we don't have to go to other times in history, right? Because we already have that example now, where here are this group of people who are perfectly healthy and leading normal lives, and they have hallucinations and delusions, and they're either informally or informally dealing with that by considering themselves to be psychic, right? So we already have that situation. But yes, it can also be true that there are certain things that might have been more like a different range of the trait might have been more adaptive at a different point in evolutionary history. But even now,
even in the modern context,
exactly,
it could be adaptive. There's contexts today where
yeah, that's what I wanted to point out, right? Is that, and I really like the whole neurodiversity movement, because what they are pointing out is precisely that these differences that people have, first of all, everybody's got differences. It's not, there aren't categories, there are continuous distributions of a whole ton of different traits. And whatever your unique profile is not inherently pathological. It is only, you only develop pathology when whatever your particular extremities or weaknesses are interact with your situation in such a way that you cease to be able to pursue your goals effectively, and you cease to be able to adapt in order to get back on track. Right? You got to have that second part, because it's not like in a cybernetic system. Cybernetic systems by definition are things that correct their course based on feedback. So merely being off course for a while or being blocked for a while is not the hallmark of psychopathology. You have to add in that extra piece, which is that you're also not able to engage effectively the mechanisms that allow you to adjust and get back on course.
Like if you're not blocked at some points, you might not be trying hard enough. Like sometimes it's good to swing for the fence.
There are vicissitudes in life, right? If your entire life, if you have never had something go wrong, well, God bless you, you're lucky. But right, that's not how it works.
So for goals, it makes sense that it's like definitional almost, that for that individual, that's going to be distress, that they value these goals and now they can't move towards them in a sustainable way, and they can't correct to get back on track. And so
yes, I mean, that's almost certainly going to be distressing. And I think, so one of the interesting things, of course, is sensitivity to distress is itself a personality trait that varies. So you find people who are, very rare, obviously, but who are completely sort of thwarted and not getting anywhere and still are not particularly distressed, because they're just so low in that sensitivity to distress to begin with. And our theory allows that you might actually be able to diagnose somebody as having a mental illness, even if they are not distressed. And I guess, the classic case where you see that is in disorders related to antagonism, right? Where the person's problem is that they cannot get along with other people. They might be, callous, belligerent, whatever. They don't care about other people, or they care, but, want to treat them badly, or just don't know how not to treat them badly. And so you can end up with people who are undermining their own goals constantly, but because it's through these antagonistic processes, they just assign the blame for their own problems to everybody else, right? So they're not distressed about themselves. They may be frustrated, or but they direct their anger outward.
So they're externalizing, but most things are repeat games, And so if you're going into the world with this kind of antagonistic personality, you're going to probably ultimately be self-undermining, unless like by some freak occurrence, like you come out ahead and somehow get like elected president or something. And even
Yeah,
then, you might end up
or
self-undermining.
like,
Who
okay,
knows?
so that's a fluke. That one was, but what we hope. But like, what about a culture that rewards aggressive behavior? What about a culture that is heavily based on the prestige of warriors, for example, or the prestige of ruthless CEOs, like the Gordon Gekko archetype, right? There are plenty of niches for very disagreeable people in this world if they have the right combination of other things to somehow make it work given the options available. And so one of the things that we talk about in our theory is that people always want to say, well, if you base psychopathology on the inability to pursue your own goals effectively, what if you have goals that involve hurting other people, but you still are able to pursue them effectively? Is that psychopathology? And our answer to that is no, that's not psychopathology. But that kind of profile is risky because, as we were just discussing, often antagonizing and mistreating other people does end up undermining you. But like the other thing we say is that is just primarily a matter for legal correction rather than medical correction. Right? So we make this distinction very clearly, right, with the whole insanity defense, that there's a difference between doing something wrong, hurting other people, for which we say you're mentally ill, or for which we say you are legally responsible and you need to like pay a fine or go to jail. And so we
people
don't
might be
say
misunderstanding you and saying like, okay, if these goals are individually beneficial, they get away with it. They get away with basically defecting on others. But you're not saying, well, there's nothing that should be done about this. No, there's a place to be done. That's why we have a legal system. That's why we have reputation. That's why we have moral communities.
It's not a medical problem, right? Because it's not a pathology in the medical sense or a psychopathology. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but we should, like, you wanted me to go through high top. So high top is this system of classifying features of psychopathology using dimensions. And it happens kind of amazingly that the major dimensions of psychopathology, almost all of them correspond very closely to the major dimensions of personality. So for each one of the big 5 traits, there is a corresponding dimension of psychopathology. And, you can say that's remarkable, but then it's not remarkable if you think that it reflects this basic idea that psychopathology and the way things go wrong is simply a reflection of the standard variation in people's functioning, and their extremities are likely failure points in the system.
These are major dimensions of variation among people, but dimensions of variation with respect to the fundamentals of being a goal-seeking system in the world.
Yeah.
Then when these things go wrong, you're going to notice, and we're going to have names for this, and it's going to be it's remarkable. But then it's like, well, if
right. And it's not just any goal-seeking system. It's a human goal-seeking system, right? A social animal. And so one of these dimensions is reflecting antagonism versus agreeableness, right? Because we need to be able to coordinate and cooperate with other people, at least to some extent, in order to function. Like how much is a question for individual variation. Some people are always helpful. Some people are rarely helpful, but some of it is necessary for function in the world. And so there's agreeableness corresponding to antagonism. There's detachment as the opposite of extroversion. There's neuroticism, negative emotion, internalizing problems. Those are all just that's the same thing basically.
You said human just now, but to what extent would you say that any primate within its troop, maybe any mammal, that there might be a good amount of what do you, if you took high top, is it transmammalian?
Is it transmammalian? No, I can tell you, I can tell you very much. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to talk about high top because that's explicitly focused on psychopathology, but let's talk about the big 5 and personality, because in the last couple of decades, there's been a huge burst of focus on animal personality. and studying individual differences in behavior, persistent individual differences in other species, and even looking for parallels and thinking about this as personality, even though they're not persons, are they? They are, other primates, but or other primates. I mean, octopus, dog, you name it. People have done studies of personality now. And so a lot of them are cross species, right? These basic things like sensitivity to negative emotion, sensitivity to punishment and threat, those appear to be pretty universal across species. Things like components of extroversion, like sociability or dominance, how assertive you are relative to other individuals. So yeah, a lot of these things cut across species, but not all of them, because conscientiousness, for example, is a dimension that doesn't seem to appear in most other species, but it does clearly appear in chimps and bonobos, our nearest evolutionary relatives. And I think that's because conscientiousness is not just about suppressing impulses, it's about organizing behavior around relatively abstract or future-oriented goals. And most species simply don't coordinate toward goals sufficiently far in the future.
So you need a sufficiently complex goal hierarchy and plans that would involve that kind of complexity for you to be able to even get into trouble that kind of way, where you need this sort of this kind of meta rationality of conscientiousness, saying like, no, don't jump at that thing.
Right.
Like keep your overall set of plans, the overall complex
and it's not
goal hierarchy.
Right, and it's
mind.
Yeah. Sorry, I got excited. Right. And it's not just
Good.
Don't jump at that because it might be dangerous, which other animals can do, right? There are paradigms to study impulsivity in rodents and, in other species. So it's not just about not being impulsive. It's more that in other species, the impulsivity coheres with these more basic level systems. Like you're impulsive about reward if you're highly reward sensitive. You're impulsive about threat if you're highly threat sensitive, or maybe the balance of threat and reward sensitivity leads to impulsivity. But you don't see this overarching set of capacities for planning, for avoiding distractions, regardless of the distraction, right? That's what conscientiousness is about. It's about this ability to effectively prioritize your goals and then have those guide your actions.
So, and we've seen some evidence for this in other higher primates. Any dogs or?
I don't believe that a conscientiousness dimension has been detected in dogs.
They should have looked at shepherds.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, right. You would think it would vary by breed, right? Because one of the interesting things about dogs is that we actually breed them to have different personality traits systematically across different types.
Shepherds are unlike other dogs.
Yeah, well, and collies, for example, collies are interesting because, like border collies, incredibly smart and trainable, and something like conscientious, perhaps. I mean, but are they organizing their behavior, or are their handlers organizing their behavior? Right. This is why I don't remember if we talked about this in our last conversation, but it's very, very hard to study conscientiousness using laboratory tasks. It's hard to find a task where you might think like, okay, you're going to play this little computer game where you have to avoid distractions or whatever. And then you think, well, that's going to correlate with people's conscientiousness assessments on standard personality surveys. No, or, at most very, very weakly. And I think that's because when you're in the lab, your goal priorities are already scaffolded and basically determined by the fact that you've agreed to be in that environment and to go along with the experiment. Where conscientiousness matters is where you have the freedom to prioritize your own goals, and it's not heavily determined by your current environment. And so, I don't know if a collie is conscientious or they're just really trainable, right? And smart enough to be trained and then to respond quickly and accurately. But at the same time, they tend to be a real pain in the ass because their personalities are designed for work, and so they tend to be often kind of skittish or slightly aggressive in human context. In my experience, I know now we're going to get like loads of people angrily saying that I've maligned collies. The collie lovers out there. So let's take a step back and make it more abstract. That some breeds of dogs might have, there might be costs and benefits to breeding for different personality traits. So this is a big tangent.
If you're thinking of,
we've often talked about the P factor.
The P factor is like almost like the inverse of stability. Right. You could potentially still find something P factor like cross species, but the stability would not be one where you have something like conscientiousness as part of it. It might be, for instance, neuroticism in terms of the goal threat sensitivity, and agreeableness also if it's like a highly social species. But you still could have something P factor like, even if you remove conscientiousness and agreeableness, potentially if it's like an isolated animal, in terms of something like, just if you're overly threat sensitive, that would be like destabilizing.
Yeah.
But I guess
So
you don't ever need to invoke the P factor. It's just on
right. But let's define the P factor first of all. So we've got high top, we've got this hierarchical array of dimensions of features of psychopathology. And the main level that we often focus on are these 6 major spectra, 5 of which correspond to elements of the big 5. And then the 6th one is somatoform. Interestingly, it's like concerns about physical ailments, but that are not actually physical. You know, it's like hypochondriasis, somaticizing complaints, like emotional pain that manifests as physical pain rather than emotional pain, that kind of stuff. Anyway, side note. But the interesting thing is all of those 6 also tend to co-vary together to somewhat, and that's the P factor. That's the idea that, unfortunately, if you are at risk for one form of psychopathology, you are probably also at risk for every other form of psychopathology, or almost every other. At least that's what the data suggests. There's still a lot of debate about how much of the P factor might be an artifact based on issues with assessment. I don't want to get into that right now. Let's assume that there really is this genuine tendency for things to, for all different kinds of problems to be correlated with each other. I think that would make sense because the basic idea is that each one of these dimensions reflects a different part of the system functioning extremely or going wrong. And because the whole system is interconnected and only functions through all of its interconnections, breakdowns in one area of the system are likely to cascade to breakdowns in other areas of the system as well. So it makes sense that you would get this kind of general risk factor for psychopathology. But it is interesting that one place in which the parallel between measurements of psychopathology and measurements of normal range personality breakdown is at this highest level, because this P factor, which seems to correspond basically to the tendency to have all kinds of problems, is related to agreeableness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, but not to extroversion and openness in like half a dozen studies that have looked at this. And so what that suggests is that the general risk for psychopathology is basically equivalent to this stability factor in personality. So to the, you know, which fits perfectly with our theory because, right, psychopathology itself, if there is dysfunction, is this inability to maintain stable goal pursuit. So it's instability. But then that plasticity factor, that exploratory tendency, is not a direct index of whether you are dysfunctional or not. And that's probably because you can get yourself in trouble either with too much or too little plasticity, right? If you are extremely exploratory and you're just off on new things all the time and you're, you know, you just have that kind of volatility, behavioral volatility, not emotional volatility, but whatever, that can be destabilizing, right? If you're constantly after the new, constantly changing, that can make it harder to maintain stability. On the other hand, if you are rigid and you never change, that also makes it hard to maintain stability because then you don't adapt. Then you can't deal with changing demands of your environment.
You've mapped, so you earlier mentioned potential correspondences between like the serotonin 1A system and stability. And you've also suggested that dopaminergic functioning might be particularly important for plasticity and general exploration. And so what you're saying now, I guess, makes sense in a few ways of you know, excessive dopamine is not necessarily a good thing. Could lead to impulsivity. Right. Excessive like cognitive or excessive exploration could even be like, I guess, psychosis prone.
Right. Yeah. Like I can give you a list of things that are associated with high levels of dopamine that are problematic. Right. Mania, impulsivity, sort of addictive reward seeking, whatever the addiction happens to be to, as you say, psychosis. So basically, like that the openness component of openness and intellect from the big five is related to risk for psychosis. The assertiveness component of extroversion is related to risk for all kinds of externalizing problems, like drug use, aggressive behavior, various what we call externalizing, disinhibited and antagonistic behavior, basically. So yeah, so there's risks from both high and low dopamine.
Is that part of why it like across that, like it would cancel out almost, or like so why you would not see for something like general risk of psychopathology, openness or extroversion being part of that mix? Is it because of the too high or too low both being problematic,
Yeah,
or?
probably. And also at the subdimensional level, like openness breaks down the openness. Big five level trait properly is openness and intellect. So it's got this perceptual dimension and this more intellectual dimension. And I think we talked about this last time, right? And so openness tends to be a risk for various forms of psychopathology, whereas intellect tends to be a protective factor. And so to the degree that you have a different level, those things tend to be correlated, but to the degree that you have different levels, you can have different risk profiles. And so the fact that those are averaged together at the big five level might reduce the connection of that trait to the P factor. Same for extroversion, really.
To what extent, in terms of like looking for trans mammalian or like extensions of something like a P factor, like the limitations of that, I guess. So in your CB5T paper, like you talk about like forms of integration, and in your other work, you also talk about things like tendencies towards like being willing to learn from things, or potentially tendencies towards self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether like these could be sources of human uniqueness in terms of like ways in which things go wrong, in terms of like complex integrative processes, things involving like higher level control strategies like narrative.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to use this as an excuse to circle way back around to a point that we only got through half of, which was when we started talking about points of intervention for psychopathology. And I said that there are two forms of intervention that our theory identifies. One is related to traits and one is related to characteristic adaptations. So we started talking about traits and like retuning those basic parameters using drugs or deep brain stimulation or whatever these sort of direct biological interventions are. And then we've gotten off on all the rest of the stuff we've just been talking about. But if we come back to the other point of intervention, it would be at characteristic adaptations. And that is what you're doing when you engage in talk therapy, behavioral therapy, CBT, DBT, ACT, all of these different attempts to teach people strategies to change the way they're acting, to intervene in their own behavior, to change the way they're interpreting the world, to figure out what their goals should be and how to commit to them effectively. Like all of those things are basically going in and trying to directly affect people's characteristic adaptations, which, because of the fact that characteristic adaptations are where the rubber meets the road, is actually more directly addressing psychopathology than addressing people's traits. Because tweaking people's traits can only cure their psychopathology if it has the downstream effect of then allowing them to pursue effective characteristic adaptations in a successful manner. And so like that's the criterion that you need regardless of where you're starting. So those things that you were talking about, like integration, like most of those, so integration is just what it means to have a coherently operating system. And like disintegration is what happens. Like that is psychopathology. Psychopathology is disintegration. It's, well, I mean, and even not psychopathology so much as just hitting a point in your life where everything goes to pieces, right? That's disintegration. Like, you may not be mentally ill. You may be able to figure out how to start picking up the pieces and putting them back together again and making new pieces. But you've still experienced disintegration where your various characteristic adaptations are no longer working as a coherent set to allow you to pursue your goals effectively. And so anything that is addressing how to improve and change people's characteristic adaptations and to give them the tools that they need to do that themselves is a strategy for creating integration. And you mentioned self-deception, and that's, do we want to get into self-deception? How much more time do we have here? Do we want to talk about self-deception some other time?
Maybe a little bit now. I should
Okay.
leave a little bit after 2.
Okay.
Like 2:15 latest.
Okay. Well, so yeah, we've got some time then. Let's talk about self-deception. So self-deception is a funny concept, and it has a long history of being argued about in philosophy and psychology. Questions about, like, does it even, like, is it even coherent to talk about? And I think one of the reasons that people question its coherence is the analogy to, if it was just a direct analogy to lying, like if I'm lying to you, lying requires that I know the truth, I'm telling you what's not the truth, and I'm intentionally telling you what's not the truth, right? Those are the 3 elements of lying. If I know the truth and I accidentally don't tell you the truth, then that's just like a mistake on my part. If I don't know the truth and I don't tell you the truth, then I'm just ignorant. But so if the self is both the deceiver and the deceived, this becomes complicated. It's like, how is it possible that I know? So I have 2 beliefs, one of which I believe to be true, one of which I believe not to be true. And I'm hiding from myself the fact that I have the true belief and then somehow convincing myself of the false belief. It's very hard to see how this can work.
You need to like have like a society of mindish, or like multiplicity within the self of like subagents almost to make it work.
Dubious. Yeah, it's dubious. Well, at least it's dubious if they're all working in the same code. I guess that's the way to get around this, right? So just to talk about, like, there have been these 2, I would say there are 2 major streams of ways of understanding what self-deception is. And one of them is, this sort of Freudian repressor kind of model coming out of psychodynamic schools. And that's more like what we're talking about, where there's like, part of you knows, you have 2 beliefs, and you have 2 contradictory beliefs, and you hide the fact that you have one of them from yourself. And this is somehow voluntary, even though it's hidden. Okay, so the major way in which people say, well, okay, that's too complicated, too incoherent, we need a different explanation, is to rely on ignoring evidence, right? So if you have a belief and you ignore evidence that would contradict that belief, maybe that's what is self-deception, right? It's like you're voluntarily ignoring evidence that one of your beliefs is wrong. So now we don't have 2 beliefs in mind that are somehow like one of them's hidden, but we still have, and that's potentially coherent, except now there's a problem that we can't distinguish self-deception from ignorance. Because what if, like, I got the evidence, but I just didn't understand what the evidence meant? Like, everybody on the outside is like, you moron, like, that was how you knew that you were wrong. Like, nope, I didn't understand it. I just didn't get it. That could be genuine ignorance. So the way that we got around this problem was to basically specify that the evidence that is being ignored is your own subjective emotional states. So now it's not 2 conflicting beliefs, it's a belief that is being contradicted by an emotional reaction to something anomalous that you've experienced, right? So something happens that's not exactly as you wanted or expect it to be, and that triggers a little sense of like, like, or it could be, maybe it triggers a twinge of guilt or a twinge of anxiety, but at any rate, it triggers some kind of emotional response. Could just be surprise. And what that emotional response is telling you is that, oh, there might be an error in one of your characteristic adaptations, right? It's saying there might be an error in one of the beliefs that you have about the way that the world is, or one of the beliefs that you have about the potential consequences of your action. Like you've got this plan, you think it's going to do this. You've just gotten this emotional signal that says there might be a problem. What do you do now? Like now, that's an open question. What do you do when you get that signal? Now, one option is that you say, "Oh, drop everything. I've got to figure out what that means and if I'm really mistaken."
That can be destabilizing.
That can be a problem. But another option is there's definitely no problem here. My plan is perfect. Everything's fine. I'm going to ignore that and carry on as before.
That's not going to work either.
Right. And in fact, in the long run, it might be worse than the first one. And so it's this interesting calibration problem, right? And so we define self-deception as that option of I'm ignoring it. So you have some kind of anomalous experience, anomalous in the technical sense of like a failure of prediction, right? And they call it kind of predictive coding scheme. That failure,
sort of like an interior cingulate like signal, like saying like hey, brainstem, norepinephrine surge, wake up, like.
Insula's involved, medial prefrontal cortex, right? I mean, so one of the places that this comes out of is Antonio Damasio's work on this idea of the somatic marker. Because he noticed that people who had medial prefrontal damage often would do stupid things that you could often get them to reflect in a different situation on the fact that that was not a bad idea. Like, okay, here's an example that I like. One of the patients that he worked with would do things like go into a convenience store, go to the freezer case, eat like half a carton of ice cream and put it back and leave. Discussing this would say like, I know I did this. I know that this was a stupid thing to do. I don't know why I did it, right? It's like there should have been something that would tell you not to do that. That was not just like a kind of rational bird's eye view looking at it later, but that was actually like an emotional signal at the time that was like, maybe not. I'd like to do this, but it's probably not a good idea. And there's this, the lab paradigm that he designed to do this was one where you have these decks of virtual cards that you're picking from, and you don't know anything about them except that you can win and lose money. And the way it works is that some of the decks of cards you win a lot of money, but you also lose a lot of money, and over time you actually lose more than you gain. The other decks of cards you don't win so much, but you also don't lose so much, and over time you actually profit. And so what happens when normal people are playing this game is that they basically they start out gravitating toward the bad decks because they're the big wins. But after a few punishing losses, they start to gravitate away from them. And in the end, they're picking basically from the safer decks that are giving them a profit. And you can actually
I feel like I'm doing that over my lifespan. Anyways,
if you're doing it right, you are. You hope. But the cool thing is that what you can see if you've got them hooked up to electrophysiological measurements like skin conductance, where you can see like that sort of basically just low-level emotional arousal, is that there is an increase in emotional arousal, just sort of non-specific emotional arousal that goes along with getting those bad outcomes. And what you see is that people develop that affective signal, which Damasio calls the somatic marker, right? Because it's like low level, it's of the body, soma. It's what we call a gut feeling, right? That's a gut feeling. It's somatic. It's like when you say, I've got a bad feeling about this. I've got a gut feeling that maybe I shouldn't do that. And what he shows is that you can see that people develop those somatic markers before they gravitate away from the bad decks. It's like before they can't necessarily consciously, like they're complex probabilities. They can't, if you stop them and say like, what do you know about these decks? They don't have a clear sense of exactly what the probabilities and frequencies are for each one, but they're starting to get a gut feeling about that one. And that's what predicts when they're going to gravitate away from it. Now you take patients with this medial prefrontal damage, they never get this, they never generate the markers. They never start to get the gut feeling emotional signal that says maybe this isn't such a bad idea. So that guy,
so they might be acting as functionally as if they're self-deceived, but it's not even, so your model, if I'm understanding, it's like an evidence ignoring model, but it's specifically saying like the way in which we know what evidence we should tune into is through these somatic markers.
Right. It
And
has to
so
be
they,
subjective. It has to be subjective, emotional, affective evidence that we then voluntarily ignore. Can't be
and
just
so by
ignoring.
default, they're almost like a state of self-deception, functionally speaking.
Right. So that's the
If you,
interesting thing is they're not self-deceived. Why? Because they're malfunctioning. They're not getting an error message, so they're not ignoring anything. They're not deceiving themselves because they don't have the signal in the first place. The person who is self-deceptive is basically lobotomizing themselves, right? They are turning themselves into a medial prefrontal patient because they are voluntarily refusing to follow up on evidence suggesting that they might be in error, right? And this is not to say that you should always abandon your plans when you get a sense that something might be wrong. That would be a disaster.
that'd be
Right? You'd never,
destabilizing
you'd
also.
never,
Yeah.
you'd never do anything. But you have to be willing to explore, even if it's just a moment to think like, okay, is there a possibility that this is wrong? Like, do your due diligence, right? You have to explore. And like, okay, it's an open question about how much due diligence you have to do, right? And that's where, various different tunings will come in. And some people, if we take a bunch of people, none of them self-deceptive, some of them will, when they get an error message, go much more in depth into checking whether it's an error than others. Fine.
So
Those are just individual differences. It's hard to figure out what the optimum is. But the one thing we know is that you should not just entirely ignore the possibility that you might be in error when your own, subconscious level systems have thrown up an error signal that you are capable of being consciously aware of.
So for it to be self-deception, it's an actual set of policies or tendencies and like action selection for your attention, where you're actually disattending, as opposed to
Right.
you didn't have the capacity to begin with. I guess I'm wondering, could there be maybe at least two kind of qualitatively different paths, where one might be kind of like earlier you were mentioning the kind of pathology of like not being bothered enough, where it's just like by default you just ignore things because you're like, yeah, don't care. But I'm wondering if there's like another one potentially where it's like there's some of these somatic markers you do attend to, but you're actually hypersensitized to them. And this leads to a kind of like meta level conditioning where like because you can't handle error, that initial one like registers too much, you then adopt a policy of ignoring like these signals. I don't know
Yeah,
if that
that's
makes
a really interesting point, and I have thought about sort of cases like that. So to start with the easier one, it's like it's very hard to find things that are bad that are associated with with low neuroticism. Okay, so there, one thing might be like a complete sort of fearlessness that goes along with psychopathy, right? Sort of callousness, fearlessness. You don't have emotional checks on your behavior, so you hurt other people indiscriminately.
you might like start some sort of like ridiculous scammy university or something like this, and then like anyway, just for
Sure.
sake of argument, right?
Sure. Although I don't think what we're seeing there is low neuroticism. Okay, we've got extreme volatility. So
He's
yeah,
protesting a bit too much.
but okay. So right, that kind of the stereotypical like cold, callous psychopath. Maybe you've got overly lack of fear. But there is another thing, which is that self-deception is strongly strongly negatively correlated with neuroticism. In other words, people who are high in a self-deceptive tendency, especially like tendencies toward overconfidence, tend to be right, because overconfidence is another way of is a much simpler way of saying what we're talking about here, right? Overconfidence means you believe that you're always right, which suggests that you probably ignore evidence when you're not. That's self-deception, or that's one form of self-deception. And in that case, like you can see that being low in neuroticism, meaning you just generally don't throw a lot of error messages, might mean that you just in general are not that used to attending to error. So it might then be easier to ignore the few and relatively weak error signals that you do get, right? So that might be one genuine risk of being low in neuroticism, that you are more prone to self-deception. You got to be extra careful to check yourself and to be on top of like, am I just ignoring something because I can and it's easy? And
A dark side of having a charmed life potentially.
right. It's because it's inconvenient to consider that you might be wrong. We hate being wrong, right? On a low level, and it's annoying. On a high level, it's terrifying. So it's always more convenient just to ignore evidence that you might be in error. But then the other thing that you're talking about is like high neuroticism self-deception, which I think is really fascinating. And you definitely see this in like clinical context, where what's the lie? The lie to the self is, I can't do this, right? It's like, I don't need to do this because I can't do it. It's like, everything's going to go wrong. I will avoid it. I just won't do it. It's like procrastination often involves self-deception, right? Because it's at some level you're thinking like, I can get away with this, right? Everything's hard. Everything's unpleasant. Everything's anxiety provoking. I can get away with not doing it.
You're abdicating, but you're like, oh, I have no option. But it's actually an abdication.
Yeah, I mean, and you may know that like I should be doing this, but I'm not. But at some level, you're still telling yourself that you can get, like from moment to moment, as you procrastinate, you're telling yourself, I can get away with another moment. And you're probably
that doesn't resonate in the slightest with me.
No, I'm sure it doesn't. Of course not. But right, and so like, what's the error signal going to be there? It's going to be something like a twinge of guilt, right? Where it's like you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, and maybe it's not self-deceptive, right? Like maybe you are just wallowing in that guilt and you're very aware of it and you're doing it wrong, and like that's not necessarily self-deception. But I think often those kinds of patterns are associated with a certain degree of self-deceptiveness, right? Where
it's almost like it almost seems a little bit continuous, like a kind of malingering, almost like.
Yeah, I mean, right, because it's always tempting to either blame somebody else or blame your circumstances, or to believe that you can get away with it. So yeah, I think there's room for self-deception there, but the more common forms of self-deception are either they're forms of overconfidence, right? So there's either personal overconfidence, right? Just sort of whatever shades into narcissism, like I'm always right. I know, like my theory is perfect. My ideas are perfect. My plans are perfect. And then there is the external source of perfection or justification, right? This is the fundamentalist form of self-deception. I myself am nothing, but I have devoted myself to this perfect system. Anything that crops up to suggest that the system may be in error is ignorable or punishable, smashable, whatever. Right? Because that's where you get that that narcissistic rage. And I guess you could have people now talk about collective narcissism, right? It's like you either get the personal narcissism is like you say I'm not the greatest, smash. And then the collective narcissism is like you say my cultural institutions, my group, whatever it is, whatever this abstract entity on which I have staked my identity. If you say that is even might be flawed in some way, then smash.
You have the seeds of war with this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in some ways, self-deception, pride is the root of every sin, right? That's the good Christian philosophy. Like self-deception is at the heart of a lot of dysfunction, because the main thing that you have to be able to do is to adapt, right? The world, you have to stay stable, right? I mean, in some ways, that's your first job, is staying stable. But if you can stay stable, you also have to be able to adapt. And in fact, you need to be able to adapt in order to stay stable over any sufficiently long period of time.
And for that, the error signal is your friend. Like you need to be able to take some of that discomfort.
Got to be able to take discomfort.
You need to
got to be willing to explore. Don't have to throw out your plans at the slightest provocation, because that just makes, then you're just dysfunctional from anxiety, depression. Like throwing out your plans at the slightest provocation is definitely not the solution, but being willing to consider that provocation, whatever it was, means that you might need to change or that you might need to rethink. That is the basic kind of openness that you need to not go wrong.
It seems like whether we're talking about like the overconfident variety or maybe like the vulnerable neurotic varieties of self-deception, there's like a point of like positive feedback of a vicious cycle sense where like, because you have not taken that domain and explored it, you don't have a good like mapping of it, and so it's going to be just full of uncertainty and error signals. Like you'll like the ability to actually go into that domain with enough confidence to stay the course and navigate it, the more you avoid it, the harder that's going to be. And then you're going to want to keep avoiding it. And then the harder that's going to be. And then you're going to want to keep avoiding it.
Right. Because the unknown only grows when you don't engage with it.
It reminds me somewhat of like some of our conversations where you talked about this one book you've been trying to get me to read on the hippocampal system and anxiety.
Oh, Jeffrey Gray and Neil McNaughton, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, second edition. Yes, one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of psychology. A very impressive book. What, you still haven't read it?
Not yet. No.
Now, did you read Gray's book on consciousness?
Not yet. No.
Okay, well, while we're plugging Jeffrey Gray, my favorite book on consciousness is his book, it's the last book he wrote before he died, called Consciousness Creeping Up on the Hard Problem. There are a couple of his conclusions that I don't agree with about consciousness, but on the whole, I think it's the best. And a really just sort of great synthetic review. I think he gives a little bit too much credence to quantum theories of consciousness in the end. Mm-hmm. I think he is inappropriately dismissive of functionalism. There are a few things, but that book really put together for me the way in which cybernetics is the set of laws that you need to complement, basic physical laws if you are going to understand life and biology. Right? That there is a way in which, so we can talk about reductionism, we can talk about different kinds of reduction. So I'm going to say that biology is not reducible to physics. I don't mean that there are things that that don't obey physical laws. I don't mean that all biological systems are not physical systems, because of course they are. But when we talk about laws that you can use to provide explanations for the behavior of things, what Gray points out is that you cannot, so DNA has this remarkable property that the physical laws entail that it can be in essentially any order, right? You can have base pairs in any order. That means that if you're going to understand what the order of base pairs is in an organism, you cannot explain that or predict that based on physical laws. You could predict it historically, right? You could go back to like the beginning of time and track all physical events and see how DNA came together and then recombined and blah blah blah. You'd be just doing like a history at the molecular atomic level of evolution. That's no good, because that's like maximally decompressed. A law is something that allows you to explain something in a nice compressed way. So if you were going to have any kind of law that is going to describe what what the sequence is going to be in a DNA molecule, you need something that describes in a law-like way the processes, of evolution, but more of what evolution builds. Like, what are the products of evolution going to be, right? Because evolution is this historical process, whereas what you're looking for is something that is like a cross-sectional law. And for that, what you get is cybernetics, right? Because evolution necessarily builds cybernetic systems. It necessarily builds systems that use feedback in order to pursue goals that allow them to survive and reproduce, because reproduction, of course, is why the things are here.
So our causal account that will allow us to explain and predict is going to require properties that are not found on the physical level, but have to be there at the level of the phenotype of the cybernetic system and its interactions with the environment.
Right, and so I'm always cautious about saying that they're not there at the physical level. They are there at the physical level because everything is the physical level. They supervene on the physical, which means that they can't change without the physical level changing. But the point is that in order to describe them in a law-like way, you can't just say, here is the way in which molecules interact with each other. There's a new set of laws is generated once cybernetic systems appear, and therefore, like, cybernetics is the basis of a law-like understanding of biology. and of information and intention and reference and meaning.
We're coarse graining at the level of the joints in nature that would define agents as agents.
Yeah,
that would
right,
define
basically. Like an agent appears. Well, what are the laws of agents? They have their own set of laws.
It's what would be visible to natural selection.
Yes, exactly. Right. So very early on in the process of self-replicating systems, you have to have something like an agent appear. That's probably a decent place to end.
Yeah. This was great. Thank you, Colin.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll keep. So next time, so we've gone to psychopathology and maybe well-being and flourishing next. Or
yeah, I mean, we started talking about some of that. You know, what I would have to say about well-being, just in talking about why to avoid self-deception and integration. But yeah, we can definitely talk in more depth about well-being and various other things.
Very much looking forward to it. Thanks,
All
Colin.
right.